Okay, hey everyone. Today we're going to be taking a look at how I calculate my Ironman nutrition. Commonly known as the fourth discipline in an Ironman, and it really is critical. You can pretty much get away with making nutrition mistakes in an Olympic, a sprint, even a half Ironman. But an Ironman really is so long that any nutrition mistakes really come back to bite you, especially on the run. So you don't want this to happen to you. The first thing I do is calculate how much energy I use. So in the human body, let's assume a 75 kilogram male with 12% body fat, which is probably a pretty athletic representation of a high-level age grouper. The amount of energy available from fat is over 50,000 calories, right? And this is a lot. This is multiple days of marathon running that you could sustain at a fat-burning pace before needing to refuel at all. So in theory, many days, practically for the purposes of an Ironman, this is an unlimited store of energy. Glycogen, on the other hand, which is your carbohydrate stores from the liver and muscles, is, based on the calculations for my body, would be a maximum of around 3,500 calories. Now, the 3,500 calories calculation is the absolute best case scenario. So this is with a very specific carb loading protocol, maximum storage in both the legs, the arms, or the lower body, the upper body, and the liver. The way I've calculated this is doing an actual DEXA scan and working out the lean muscle mass of both my quadriceps, hamstrings, calves, and upper body muscles, and calculating based on the scientific evidence of extreme carb loading protocols what the glycogen storage could be at. So this is absolute best case scenario, unlikely to happen unless I'm pretty lucky leading up to a race. So for my calculations, I'm assuming that it's closer to actually 2,000 calories made up of muscle glycogen and liver glycogen. Now, the way to think about this is the main difference between liver glycogen and muscle glycogen is the liver glycogen is more of a general store. So it can be used by the body no matter what type of exercise you're doing. But as you can see, it's very limited, about 400 calories or 100 grams. The muscle glycogen is more plentiful, but that glycogen can only be used when those muscles are functioning. For example, if you were going to go and do a marathon swim where you're not really using your legs much, that glycogen stored in your legs is not going to be freed up and transported to where it's needed. It can only be used where those muscles are active. So that's an important distinction to remember when we're thinking about liver glycogen versus muscle glycogen. So this already scarce energy source, glycogen, is even more scarce because of the requirement to only use it in the muscles that are being exercised. So now I do a test, and how this test works is you use a metabolic cart with a mask and you are breathing into this mask while you're exercising, and the protocol that I use is to exercise at my various race intensities. So I would go right from easy riding right through to the upper Ironman or even half Ironman type of efforts based on the power numbers that I know I'm going to ride in the race. So there's a lot that's gone into that. If you think about what I just said, I have to know my power numbers. I have to know how hard I'm going to be riding during the race. I have to know what those power numbers are, and I have to know that there's various levels of that. And I spend a long time in each interval. So I'm measuring maybe 5 minutes at each effort level, and then that is giving me a breakdown of the fat versus the carbohydrate at each level. Now, if you don't have a power meter, it can still be done in a lab. You could go in and basically on their power bike, their ergometer bike, ride to feel, and they could see what the watts are at each level, and that would give you the power, but it would be based on your perceptions. That'd have to be really dialed in. It's really going to be much more accurate and useful for you if you use a power meter for both training and racing. So the outputs of the test. So I did a test where I'm riding at 185 watts, 245 watts, 265, and 285. Now in this chart, you can see the blue part of the chart is how much carbohydrate I'm using. This is measured in calories per hour of carbohydrate. And the yellow part is a nice fatty color, yellow, and this is measuring the amount of fat that I'm burning per hour at these various levels. So if you look at this, you can see what this trade-off would be. If I'm riding at 285 watts, I'm using more than 200 calories per hour than if I'm riding at 245 watts, and significantly more than if I'm riding at 185 watts. So this still gives me a good set of data upon which to then build my nutritional plan. Now, the nutritional plan, I'm going to only be putting in the carbohydrate calories burned. Remember in that first slide, we looked at the availability of fat versus carbohydrate. Fat is highly available. There's no need to consume that during a race. It is plentiful. So the only thing I'm concerned with is how much glycogen I'm burning, how much carbohydrate do I have to replace, because that is the scarce thing in this situation. So what I do is I then open up this model that I use in order to calculate my race day power or pace versus my consumption. So I'm looking at my output versus my input. How much am I spending versus how much am I able to take in? And this is really the balance that makes the big difference in planning out my day. All right, so this is a Ironman nutritional calculator that I developed. And let me walk you through it quickly. So what we want to do here is put in the starting glycogen. And as I mentioned before, just to be conservative, I assume only 2,000, even though with an optimal day and the perfect carb load and with all the scientific method, it could be higher than this. I don't want to assume that it's going to be perfect. So 2,000 is what I use. And then I put a start time in here, and this is where I put in all my expected splits. So I've just put an hour for the swim, 5 hours for the bike, and 3:15 for the run. This really changes course to course, so I'm just using a very general example. Now, based on the measurements, I know that I want to calculate just the carbohydrates per hour burned, so the calories of carbohydrate burned per hour. That is what I'm interested in. It doesn't matter to me how much fat I'm burning per hour. Number one, because this isn't a fat burning competition. And number two, I don't need to replenish fat. Remember, I don't need to replenish fat. Fat is plentiful, so there's no need to supplement that or take that in during the race. The thing that is scarce during an endurance event is carbohydrate. So that's all I'm caring about here. So on the swim, 350 calories of carbohydrate per hour. That is what I've calculated for me, and the total here is closer to 1,000, but a very high percentage of that is fat. The swim is a relatively low endurance effort. My heart rate rarely goes above 118, even at Ironman paces. So this is what it is for me. For others, it could be different. I'm obviously not taking in any calories during the swim in an Ironman. If this was Ultraman, I am actually taking in a fair amount of calories, probably 1,500 or less, probably about 800 to 1,000 actually. And here's the delta. So I started with 2,000 calories of glycogen. That's how much I have available in my liver and in my muscles. Now, remember that glycogen can only be used in the muscles that it's stored in that you're using, right? So you can't, if it's predominantly upper body, like the swim, it's not going to use glycogen from your legs. And quite likely most of it's going to come from your liver because it's the first event. So liver and mainly upper body, that's where this glycogen is coming from. So I'm going to exit the swim with a current fuel tank, if you like, of glycogen of 1,650. Then on the bike, I'm assuming a bike time of 5 hours. I know that I'm burning 543 carbohydrate calories per hour, but I'm only able to take in 400, let's say. And this is what I take in on a reasonably hot race. If it's very hot, like 110 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to be even less than this. If it's a cold race, I'll probably take in more than this. So this is just for a typical race that's reasonably hot, but not paralyzingly hot. So 5 hours at 400 per hour, I have a a delta after 5 hours of 715. So I get off the bike, my fuel tank's now going to be on 935 carbohydrate calories of glycogen. Now, if I go to the run and I'm only able to take in 100 carbohydrate calories per hour, I can see that I'm going to run out of fuel, and that is going to be a problem. So I know that I can take in more, maybe 200 or 300. What I really want to do in the run is not take in too much. The more that I take in, the higher the chance of some sort of gastric distress. So I'm going to go change this and see if I make this 150, this is probably going to be okay for me. It's going to put me in the green. So I basically play around with all these variables, and from this I know that if I bike up to 285 watts, which is higher than I'm going to do for an Ironman, this is going to be an okay nutrition strategy, provided that I'm able to take in 400 calories per hour on the bike. This is the critical part here. If I was only able to take in 300, you can see this really starts changing things. So I've got to then take more on the run, which I don't really want to do. I can take in 300 on the run, and that gets me in the green again. But really, personally, this is my own personal situation. For me, I know I can take more than this on the bike. So 350 puts me in the green, and I only have to take in 150. Well, actually more than that, 200 on the run. And then if I really wanted to take in more, if I wanted to take in 500 calories on the bike, I could probably get away with a lot less than that. So you can see just this additional amount of calories per hour on the bike really sets you up for a much easier time on the run, just because your requirement to take in is not that high. And that's really how I go about doing it. I change all these variables, play around with it. I have the actual data to be able to forecast this, and there's really two things I can do to influence the outcome of this race from a nutrition point of view. I could either bike easier, or I could take in more calories. I could run easier or take in more calories. So there's no real other options. The two choices are carbohydrate consumption or pacing. So this calculation influences both my pacing strategy as well as my consumption. Now, if for example, I was burning 900 calories per hour on the bike, you see I would be heavily in the red here. So my only option in this case, because I can't consume much more than 500, my only option is to ride easier on the bike. And in that case, I would use a lower power level. And in this case, I would put in my lower level of output. And let's say I was only burning 350 on the bike, and that then I'm only able to take in 200. I'm playing around with all these things in order to get to the values that I need. So either have to race easier or take in enough fuel. All right, so how can you go about doing this for yourself? Well, first of all, you need to know your race intensities. If you have a coach, you should already know that, or they should be working with you to determine that. If you don't have a coach and you're self-coached, I'm sure you are pretty close at this stage to figuring out what your race intensities would be. If you have no idea where to start, feel free to contact me. I do session consults, even if you're not a coached athlete. Happy to help you figure that out. Once you know your race intensities, you need to do the test. Now, you can either find a local lab. Any sports science center that offers VO2 max testing will be able to do this. The key thing is you need to use a specific protocol. You cannot really use the VO2 max protocol because that just uses 1 minute increments in order to ramp up the test. It's called a ramp test. They use 1 minute increments, and it's not sufficient enough to reach that steady state that you need to analyze for long distance endurance training. That test is of value itself, but it's not going to give you the information that you need for this. So they need to use a specific protocol. I can help you to figure out what that should be. Basically, they need to use 5 minute intervals. So you do 5 minute intervals at your various race intensities. I have a lower race intensity and a higher race intensity. I would recommend doing at least those two. And then from there, you need them to be able to share the data with you. And then you can do that sort of analysis where based on the data, you can work out how much fat and carbohydrate you're using. And then you can use a race calculator similar to the one that I showed. Now, if you need additional help, you can't find a lab or whatever, we are actually able to do this remotely as well. If you want to get in contact with me, I can help you figure out how to do that. The cheap option, which is not going to cost you any money at all, is to just do this by trial and error. Because if you think about it, at the end of the day, once we've done all the lab testing, everything's said and done, what you're going to do is take in your maximum amount that you're able to handle on the bike, and you're going to take in the maximum number you're going to be able to handle on the run. And those two numbers will be different. Generally, people can take in more on the bike than on the run. And we're really interested in carbohydrate. So during a race, the only thing that really matters from a fuel point of view is carbohydrate. There's no point in taking in fat because you have enough fat stores, even if you're very lean, to give you the fuel that you need. You don't need protein. Some people take protein because they want to prevent muscle breakdown. However, muscle breakdown is only going to occur from a metabolic point of view if you're completely depleted of carbohydrates. So if you keep your carbohydrate stores up, that is a much better way to prevent muscle breakdown than taking protein. Bear in mind that protein is going to take up space, at least in your stomach. Fat's going to take up space in your stomach that's going to prevent the fast absorption of carbohydrate. So you really want to prioritize carbohydrate. The only reason to take anything else would be if it's going to make you feel better or you feel you really need some sort of other food during the event. But if you're strictly focused on performance, carbohydrate's the thing that you're looking at. With that in mind, you would work out the maximum carbohydrate you can take on the bike, the maximum carbohydrate you can take on the run, and then through trial and error, you'll figure out if you have your calculations correct. Personally, I don't recommend that just because it's going to take a long time to figure that out. With me, it took maybe 6 Ironmans to really get that dialed in, and by the 7th one, I had figured that out. So trial and error is cheap, but at the end of the day, could actually be more costly.